In 1973, a film directed by Mario Monicelli and starring none other than him, the Prince of Italian comedy, Ugo Tognazzi, was released in Italian cinemas. The film is titled We Want the Colonels, and in the poster we see a shouting Tognazzi wearing a camouflage outfit and a paratrooper's beret, almost engaged in pushing back the crowd. It doesn't take much to understand the plot of the film, and especially to understand its practical references. The film is a real gem. It is still on sale today for genre enthusiasts. Essentially, it deals with an attempted coup that in the end turns into a farce. However, all things considered, it favors an authoritarian turn in the country. The story is set in Italy and is a work of fiction. Well, like all cinematic works, it is, so we can't deny it. But what is narrated in the film is not exactly all the brainchild of Mario Monicelli and Ugo Tognazzi. The background, the behind the scenes, that's all true. We Want the Colonels. It's nothing more than a satire of what would have been called the forestry coup. Well, even this expression is quite reductive because although agents of the Forestry Corps were also involved, it was not an attempt at a coup d'etat. It was not a farce, but something extremely serious. And it was very close due to details, as often happens in history. It didn't turn our country from a fragile democracy, but nonetheless achieved 25 years earlier, with sweat, with the blood of so many innocents, of so many people who had believed in the ideal of freedom. To bring it back towards a dictatorship, or to equate it with other European countries that were experiencing dictatorship on their own skin during the same period. This is the story of the coup that didn't happen, and fortunately it didn't happen. This is the story of a night that could have forever changed the history of our country. This is the story of the bourgeois coup. The great journalist Sergio Zavoli, who passed away recently, wrote a book, an investigation that was also the result of interviews that led to the creation of another television-style investigation with the same title, The Night of the Republic. Although the book and television investigation covered a wide span of time, with more and more and more themes, all focused, however, on the fragility of our democracy, subjected to the pressures of terrorism from the right and the left. We can say that that night, the night of the Republic, was certainly the night between December 7 and 8, 1970, the night of the Immaculate. What happens that night? There is an attempted coup that barely fails by a very small margin. The absolute protagonist of this attempted coup is him, the Black Prince, Junio Valerio Borghese, a representative of the nobility, already a commander of submarines and the 10th Mass. During the Second Fascist World War, he never renounced his adherence to fascism and saved from a death sentence issued by the partisans due to the intervention of the Americans in the war. Once the war is over, Borghese is a cumbersome character. No other label can be used. The war is over. He decided to promote the birth of a new political subject, what becomes the Italian social movement, which will be the home of those nostalgic for fascism, of that right that does not recognize itself either in the monarchist union or much less in the Liberal Party. A nostalgic right, a right that would like an authoritarian state again, is a bit what Borghese himself would also like. But the MSI over time evolves, changes, embraces new currents, new ideas, so along the way it loses pieces. In the 60s, the MSI undergoes microsplits. One is that of Pino Rauti, who breaks away. He founds the Cultural Center New Order, later the Political Movement New Order, only to return on the eve of the hottest period within the MSI, but only for practical reasons. By getting elected on the MSI lists, Rowdy protects himself from possible judicial investigations. He himself, targeted by the judiciary, is also arrested for the Piazza Fontana investigations. He is released precisely to avoid having to send the entire file to Rome, to the Port of Mists. Then there's Borghese, who also breaks away towards the end of the 60s and founds the National Front, a formation, as it was said at the time, extra-parliamentary, that is, not present among the benches of Parliament with its own representatives. But it does politics, active politics, and it proposes itself strongly, even too strongly, as a possible standard bearer for an authoritarian turn in our country. And then there's Stefano delle Chiaie, nicknamed Ercaccola because he's a bit short in stature. Delle Chiaie is the founder and leader of Avanguardia Nazionale, a youth movement deeply rooted in central and southern Italy, while Ordine Nuovo is more present in the north. These are the three subjects: Borghese's National Front, Rowdy's New Order, and Delle Chiaie's National Vanguard, trying to change the Italian political landscape in an authoritarian but also destructive sense. It's not a coincidence, it will only be discovered with the investigations of the following decades, that at a certain point some representatives of the National Vanguard and New Order go to Greece. Guests of the colonels, those colonels who have suffocated the fragile Greek democracy, initially with the complicity of the king, and then by disempowering the same sovereign, they go to Athens, guests of the colonels, for an instructive vacation, a vacation from which some neo-fascists mysteriously return, converted to anarchy. This is the case of Mario Merlino, founder of an anarchist circle in Rome, a circle that will also include the dancer Pietro Valpreda, the alleged monster of Piazza Fontana, later rehabilitated because it will actually be discovered he was just a pawn in the wrong place at the wrong time. But
we don't
stop here, because in 1968, Avanguardia Nazionale jumps to the headlines for the clashes at Valle Giulia. 68 is the year of protest, student protest, universities where protests are held or occupied. Well, the vanguardists are at the forefront of clashes with the police and other students in the Roman universities, especially in Valle Giulia, where a real battle takes place with tear gas, clubs, stones, and more. We move to 1969. It's a critical year, a year that opens with the first bombs at the fair in Milan, and not only then the bombs on the trains, in the summer, the hot autumn, the protests. On December 12th, 1969, the first major massacre, Piazza Fontana, Milan, 17 dead and almost 90 injured. It's something that shakes Italy. But what interests us in our narrative, is not Piazza Fontana. However, you can find content on Piazza Fontana on this channel with a dedicated video, and also an exclusive interview with Dr. Guido Salvini, the magistrate who reopened the case in the 90s, shedding light on various hidden points of the Piazza Fontana affair. As we said, it's December 12, 1969. 2 days later, on December 14th, a large demonstration of all the far-right extra-parliamentary movements would be scheduled in Rome. They have already asked for permissions, but at the last minute it doesn't happen. Everything is canceled. Canceled? Why? Prime Minister Mariano Rumor refused to declare a state of emergency after the bomb exploded at Piazza Fontana. And he also stood in opposition to the minister. Did he arrest the Minister of the Interior to avoid provocations? Because that public demonstration could be seen as a provocation. During the victims' funerals in Piazza Fontana, all of this is also confirmed by Vincenzo Vinci Guerra, the future compared to 69, clearly the executor of the Paetino massacre. We have already talked about this as well. Vinci Guerra testifies sometime later in front of the judges that he, along with other comrades, had prepared the banners, the poles, the flags to go to Rome, leave from Udine deep northeast, and go down by train to Rome for the demonstration. And they had been blocked at the station by the Pulfer, who had sent them home. Because no, there is no demonstration, everything canceled, trouble to make a mess. So the first question we ask ourselves at Piazza Fontana was, it's supposed to be a switch. Was it supposed to be the fuse to ignite something bigger? perhaps for an authoritarian turn, or maybe it was a dress rehearsal, or maybe, as others have said, just the beginning of a season, the season of bombs, the season of strategy, of tension. These are the questions. But let's move on. Let's go to 1970. It's a very complex year. 1970, it's a year that reserves some joy for the Italians. Recall Italy's 4-3 victory over Germany. Everyone remembers it, even those who weren't there. It has become something iconic in our historical memory as a nation. But it's also the year of the Reggio Calabria revolt, a revolt that began spontaneously, initially, in response to the decision to place the regional headquarters of Calabria not in Reggio, but Catanzaro. And those street protests, initially spontaneous due to popular indignation and initially branded by the right as vulgar thugs, those protests will be ridden by the same right, starting with a character named Ciccio Franco, who will invent the slogan, "Boy to those who give up." He is the one to lead the revolt in Reggio Calabria, a revolt that lasts a long time and that engages the forces of order to restore calm in the city. Ciccio Franco, among other things, will be rewarded for this action as a people's leader with a parliamentary seat from the MSI. Then 1970 is also the year of the Gioia Tauro Railway Massacre. A train that derails, it is said, due to a malfunction, due to a breakdown of a cart. It will take many years to learn from some mafia turncoats that
it was not
a failure. It was a deliberate act. Because at that moment, so many forces, adversarial forces, are seeking alliances even with organized crime, with the mafia. The aim is to change the country, change it according to the wishes of certain characters. And who are these characters? Beyond the mobsters who want to have free access to institutions, to replace the prefects, not even if they had returned to the times of Laci Luciano and the landing in Sicily. There are Junio Valerio Borghese and his acolytes, but there are also industrialists, politicians, military men, businessmen, and some decidedly ultra-right-wing circles within NATO. They are the ones who dream of a different Italy, a Greek-style Italy, we could say, an Italy in which reactionary forces and the military take power by establishing a repressive regime. The examples, as we have said, are Greece,
but also
Spain under Francisco Franco, who at that time is quite ill and is trying to organize the future of his regime, and Portugal, which no longer has Salazar in power. Caetano is in his place, but it is still ruled by a dark corporatist and fascist dictatorship. These are the models. Also because then in Portugal, there is a certain press agency, the Ginter Press, which is actually a center of international subversion, a sort of black specter. But we also talked about Ginter Press in a dedicated video that you can find on this channel. At the head of this organizational machine, to radically change Italy, not in a democratic way, but with a coup, is him, the Black Prince, Junio Valerio Borghese. He is the one who becomes the catalyst for the multiple interests that come from various parts. He is the one who moves with his men to gather as many souls as possible within the coup front. We said there is the mafia that asks, wants something, wants more power, wants less police, wants to be able to have control of the territory of its competence, and it offers to intervene with its own hitmen who will go to kill the police chief on the night of the coup. Then there are the military and paramilitary. There are the foresters. A forestry officer has offered to provide a motorized column for the night of the coup, a column that should reach the centers and the Rai of Via Tulada, take control of it, and then broadcast the following morning the statement read by Prince Borghese himself, informing the Italians of the occurred coup. But there are not only the foresters who will then enter the collective imagination as the protagonists of this coup, the famous foresters' coup. No, because there are also unfaithful carabinieri, unfaithful policemen, some high-ranking army officers who, at least initially, make themselves available each with different tasks. For example, there is a colonel in Verona, Colonel Amos Spiazzi, an artillery colonel, already within the nuclei for the defense of the state, a parallel and clandestine structure born following the conference of the Parco dei Principi, which we have already talked about, which will be ordered to go to the Stalingrad of Italy. That is Sesto San Giovanni, for a roundup to prevent the Stalingrad of Italy from rising. It's the stronghold of the PC Sesto San Giovanni, and it needs to be garrisoned. Then there are other official officers who must fling open the doors of the Ministry of Defense, Carabinieri, and police who must make themselves available to go and arrest parliamentarians, other politicians, journalists, members of the public opinion, all personalities that can be a hindrance to the coup. These must be picked up at their homes, loaded onto ferries at Civitavecchia, and taken to Sardinia, to the Capo Maraggi base, a NATO base, a base that was already on the cards, but little is still known about the plan. Only the plan orchestrated by General De Lorenzo, when he was the general commander of the Carabinieri, for another coup not carried out, not even tried, fortunately conducted only by the Carabinieri, for this plan alone. And then there are the officials of the Viminali who must pave the way for the vanguard, the Ordinovists, the members of the front, the road inside the Viminali itself, to take control of the telecommunication center, the hub that allows the Italian state to communicate with all the prefects, and therefore with the entire territory, and of the armory, an arsenal full of light weapons that will have to equip the insurgents. This is the plan, the so-called Tora Tora plan, from the code name used by the Japanese. In Pearl Harbor, on the other hand, it becomes operational on December 7th, 1970, that is, 29 years after the attack on Pearl Harbor, a symbolic date. The plan provides that operations begin at 9:30 in the evening and end at 10 the next morning. Just over 12 hours to take over the country and drag it into the shadows. And the plan, which is well studied, also provides for institutional cover, but not in Italy, abroad. Why has Prince Borghese asked for support from the Greek, Portuguese, and American governments? The issue is that Americans are not fully persuaded. Of course, the previous leftward shifts of Aldo Moro, who at that time is the foreign minister, have never been liked by the Americans, let alone by Tricky Dicky. Richard Nixon, who in 1970 is in the White House, advised by Henry Kissinger. And he is engaged in Vietnam, but also in a continuous arm wrestling with Brezhnev's Soviet Union and Mao's China. However, the Americans are not very convinced. They are not convinced, especially by the figure of Borghese. If Golpe is to be the head of Italy, a person, someone, a professional politician who is known and respected overseas must be put in place. The Americans would like someone solid, Fanfani, Andreotti, in short, a Christian Democrat. Then the government cabinet can be made up of technicians. There's no problem, but it can't be. Borghese does not like this. He wants to be the one to take the reins of power. After all, he has made too many promises around, even to uncomfortable environments like the mafia, to back down. So what happens? He decides to proceed anyway and even arrest Andreotti and all the other Christian Democrats. They too become targets. The coup machine gets going on the evening of December 7th. There's a column of foresters moving towards the RAI production center. There's a large gathering of Ordinovists, vanguardists, and front members who meet in a gym under the command of a former paratrooper officer, Sandro Saccucci. They are the ground force that will have to organize and carry out the first Roman actions of the coup. This force, in part, converges towards the Viminale, but does not enter from the main entrance, but from a secondary access. Someone from inside opens. It will never be known who. In a short time, the vanguard and the Ordinovists take control of the armory, load the machine guns and hand grenades onto a couple of trucks, and then head back to the gym to arm their comrades. From Verona, Spiazzi has already moved with a column of the army to go and garrison Sesto San Giovanni. There are other maneuvers underway. The mobsters are staked out in the neighborhood where the police chief lives, but they get the wrong building and end up trapped in an elevator with moments of imaginable embarrassment. When everything seems to be going well, something happens. What? It happens that the head of state Giuseppe Saragat is informed of the attempted coup. It happens that Aldo Moro himself is informed, and so are the leaders of the PC. It happens that a phone call comes to Borghese. In the middle of the night, Borghese turns pale, hangs up, tells his followers that nothing has gone as planned. Everything must be abandoned, demobilize. It happens that the vanguardists are told to return the weapons to the Viminale. All of them put them back on the racks in their places. In the end, a machine gun will be missing, and it will be quite embarrassing to have to justify its absence within that armory. It happens that the foresters are told to turn around and go home. It happens that in Spiazzi the order arrives to demobilize the outposts just set up in Sesto San Giovanni and to return to the barracks. And then why? And above all, who gave that order to return? And who informed the President of the Republic, the Foreign Minister, the head of what is perhaps the largest communist party in Western Europe at the time? For years, people will indeed wonder whose was the little hand, or rather the voice on the phone. Several investigations have hypothesized the presence of him Belfagor, as he was called at the time, the mattress maker, Licio Gelli, the venerable of the P2, the one who had developed the so-called plan of democratic rebirth, which in the end was a bit of the carbon copy of the political program that was supposed to set up the alleged and never realized bourgeois cabinet. It seems it was him or maybe someone else, someone in the NATO field, because after all, the United States is not directly informed of the coup. Perhaps some American officer decided to make a move. Also because, as some investigations will ascertain, there is a ministry that is not open to the vanguard and other coup plotters. It's the Ministry of Defense, where some officers refuse to open the doors. Perhaps that was the signal that made them rethink, that made them cancel the coup plan, that led to a review of everything within that plan to subvert the democratic and constitutional order. What is certain is that in the hours immediately following the about-face, the vanguard return home, as do the foresters and the military. Borghese packs his bags and flees to Spain. He will never return. He will die in Cadiz in 1974. It is said to be a stroke. Many of the conspirators from the Night of the Immaculate initially get away with it, then end up in the spotlight. Some, like Delicchi, prefer to emigrate, go to South America, passing through Spain and Portugal. Always those countries, Delicchi. He will be a consultant, let's say, of very dark, bloody regimes until he is arrested and extradited. But he, Spiazzi, and all the others will eventually be acquitted of the charge of conspiring against the state. There was no conspiracy. There was only an attempt at operetta guilt, a farce. This is what the judges say, who, however, perhaps base their information on a partial view. There are several pieces missing from the puzzle. Perhaps for this reason, the conspirators of the Immaculate avoid jail, because something was missing, because everyone was missing. The tapes recorded by the infiltrators of the Service of Information and Defense, the Information and Defense Service, within the coup structure in the weeks and months prior. Tapes that will only reappear many years later. Brought by Captain Antonio Labruna, former captain of the Carabinieri, then moved to the Service of Information and Defense under the office of General Maletti, and then fallen into disgrace, Captain Labruna, who brings them to Judge Salvini, who is investigating Piazza Fontana. The problem is that there is a principle, the nibis in idem. You can't prosecute people for the same crime twice. Perhaps in light of those interceptions of that evidence, we would have had, at least in the courtrooms, a decidedly different reading of the night of the Immaculate Conception in 1970. And when Italy risked becoming like Greece or Portugal, perhaps we would have had, at least in the courtrooms, a different outcome. But that doesn't change anything. Historical judgment. It was not an operetta coup. It was not the forestry coup. It was not even the satire, however beautiful, biting, proposed by Monticelli. There was no Greek colonel named Andreas. Automatic with the black glass lens, there was a colonel. Barbicane with the fake hand, there was not. It was a Colonel Aguzzo, who is actually a fool, or a Colonel Ribot, who is dotard. These caricatures were not present in the film. There was a plan, a real plan, that could completely change our country. Fortunately, as we said, it did not happen. But Italy trembled that night, the real night of the Republic. A night that could have become very long. There could have been a dawn the day after. It could have been a 20-year night like that of fascism, or even more. Fortunately, that was not the case. Fortunately, or simply because of those phone calls, or because of the refusal of the administered defense officers, or because of someone else's about-face, Italy has saved itself. But this should always make us pay attention to the signals we pick up. Because after all, there are many pushes, failed pushes or attempted pushes. They punctuate human history, not only in our country, but in Europe, Africa, Asia, the world. And when someone decides to overturn the democratic constitutional order, the risk should never be underestimated. In fact, underestimating is the worst thing one can do, because it means being able to offer another chance to those who have come so close to their goal and will surely want to try again.